Well, good morning, church. So we're in the middle of our Jesus Is series at the moment. And I've entitled today's sermon as Jesus Is Tangible. We've been working our way through a whole series, kind of looking at like who the person of Jesus is. Mostly because, well, as Christians, their key is in that term Christian, meaning Christian, meaning little Christ. And so if we say that we are followers of Jesus, then it might be a good idea for us to know a little bit more about the Jesus to which we've essentially signed our lives to in that statement of saying that I am a little Christ. I'm a Christian. Who is this Christ that we worship? Who is Jesus? And what is it about his life that has had the ability to touch lives, not just here and now, but throughout the centuries, all around the globe, of people who have been transformed from being, as we looked a few weeks back, the disciples in that moment where Jesus has just been crucified and they're terrified people hiding in an upper room, to then suddenly those same people going out and living a life for Christ, knowing full well that it would bring about their own personal death, and yet it didn't seem to stop them. And that's something that actually is worth us being able to try and grab hold of. Like, what happens? Who is it about Christ that enables people to live a life with power and authority that they shouldn't have, yet because Jesus has done something in them? And basically for us, the same concept is like, what can we do? How can we live to be able to be in that same level of authority, to be able to know that Jesus is walking alongside us and is working in and through us? And as I said, I've entitled today's talk, Jesus is Tangible. So come with me on a journey, if you would, as we begin to explore what that actually meant to people then, and then what it really means to us now. So let's take a look at the word tangible. What does tangible mean? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, it means perceptible by touch. This is where we get the term tactile from. It's that sense that something is physical, like there's an actual touch involved. There is a song that has been sung for decades. And it goes, pardon me if you would, but it goes like this. He's got the whole world in his hands. I think we all know it. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hands. And then it goes on and sings, it's got you and me. Now insert here, it could be brother or sister in his hands. It goes through and through and through until eventually he's got the whole world in his hands. You know, that chorus is something that so many have clung to and found that there is power in those words in times of need, where they've been overcome by worry or fear or pain or illness, anxiety or depression, where they've been under fear of physical death, where in that moment they've clung to the terms of that and sung almost internally that I'm in Jesus' hands. The knowledge that no matter how bad things get, that Jesus is holding them in his hands. And with that brings solace. With that brings peace. With that brings hope to many. The concept that we are in God's hands. The Bible is littered with touch. And the Old Testament, from the prophets to the Psalms, from the patriarchs to the poor, God interacts through touch. Whether that is the laying on of hands, whether it's an embrace, whether it's a simple touch, we see over and over again. And the Old Testament, from stories like Elijah, laying out his body over the young boy that had died. And in that moment of touch, the boy is brought back. To obscure moments where Moses is told to touch the stone with his stick and water will come forth. Throughout the whole of the Old Testament, the sense of touch is there. From Jacob physically wrestling with God in the night, touch is a theme. So that it is no wonder, is it, that when Jesus arrives on the scene, that he continues this tradition in stories such as, and here's a whole load of them for you. We looked only last week at Jesus as he's walking through the crowd. And there's that moment where the woman pushes her way through the crowd in order to be able to reach out and touch Jesus. In fact, she recognizes that there is something supernatural about Jesus, that in that moment as she's reaching out, if I can merely just touch the hem of his garment, then I will be healed. That's based on a messianic verse that we can go into at another point, but there's that sense that she understood that there was something even in his clothing. Just need to touch his clothing, and then I will be healed. And it says that in that moment of touch, that Jesus recognized, and he turns around, and we looked last week as he says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples think this is probably the most funniest but also like slightly annoying thing. Like, who touched me? Jesus, we are in a crowd and everybody is pressed against you. Who can you ask me who touched you? Because there's so many people here. But Jesus understood that through purposeful touch, something spiritual happened. You can read the same story in Luke's Gospel, in Luke 8, in Mark's Gospel of chapter 5, in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 9. Like, just the wonderful moment. As you read through Mark's Gospel, Mark seems to talk a lot more about the touch aspect of Christ more than any others. And in some really obscure moments, we're going to quickly take a look at some of these as we work our way through. Bearing in mind that because of what happened in Mark chapter 5, the word is out that you merely have to touch Jesus. You didn't just touch his clothing. So that in Mark chapter 14, verses 36, it talks about how the crowd asked for merely just to be able to touch Jesus' clothes. That don't worry about laying the hands on, because we understand Jesus is rushed for time almost. But it's like, please, let us merely just touch his clothing. In Mark chapter 7, we find this moment where a man who is struggling to hear with a speech impediment because of it, and he's in the village, and Jesus takes him out of the village and does this bizarre moment where he sticks his fingers in this man's ear and then spits on his hand and puts it on his tongue and then heals the man. Like, touch. Like, what's that all about? And then moments later in the next chapter, we hear of, in chapter 8, where a blind man comes. And Jesus, he spits on the guy's eyes and then touches his eyes and then prays for him that his eyes will be opened. How? Jesus does this through touch. What about that moment where all of the parents bring their children to Jesus, that he would bless them? Does he bless them by waving at them? No, they come to him for his hands to be laid upon them so that they would be blessed. And the disciples, they understand, hey, listen, Jesus is a busy man. I mean, it seems to be like a theme pretty much throughout the Gospels, that there's so much pressure on Jesus. Let us just lay your hands on my child. And the disciples are like, he's too busy. And Jesus rebukes him and says, no, let the little ones come to me. Beautiful moment. There's a man with leprosy who comes to Jesus and says, if you are willing, in Matthew chapter 8, verse 3. And Jesus says, I am willing, lays his hands on him, and the leprosy leaves. Do you remember last week we were looking at the whole concept of what is unclean versus what is holy? And so actually throughout the whole of the Old Testament, like the holy things, the things that are being set apart, cannot be touched by anything or anyone, contaminated by anything that is unholy, because in doing so, it removes the holiness from us. And so you get this sense that actually as anything that is unclean. Now, we looked at the concept of what unclean was, and we looked at a whole series of different things which are classed as unclean. But we'd be that, for example, anybody with a bodily discharge or touching of the dead or a whole series of other stuff. And leprosy is a skin defect, and that's classed also as unclean. So somebody who has got leprosy would be living out of the community because they're unclean. And that word unclean often means two things. It can either mean that something that individual has the possibility to bring about disease, or it literally is physically it's not clean. And in a world where things are nowhere near as clean as they are in our world, we understand that concept. But it also means unholy as well. And so there's that kind of like area of what unclean means. It's like one large, if you would, title that kind of overlays them all. We have this man here who has got leprosy, who comes to Jesus and understands that actually, Jesus, if you touch me, this will make you unclean. This is why the question is, if you are willing. And Jesus replies, I am willing. And as he touches him, and instead of Jesus getting leprosy, instead of it being that way around, what happens? The man is healed. Each of these stories are Jesus interacting with humanity. You and me, regular people. Jesus is meeting with regular people, and he's a tactile individual. I mean, over and over again, we see just Jesus in the concept of being around others, in physical contact with others. From the moment, for example, the Passover, where it says that John was reclining upon Jesus, like as they sat and reclined together, that actually John was the person who was almost resting up against. I love this. This is telling me that the Jesus I worship is someone who, if was in physical contact, would be somebody who would be prepared to give me a hug. Somebody who, that with the concept of me being low, would reach out to touch me, to bring me out of that moment. So let's take a moment and just take a looking at what we've looked at before and into what we're about to look at now. The idea of who is Jesus and why touch matters. Well, first off, consider this. The Almighty, the God who spoke and galaxies are created, the one who had the ability to design all of the wonderful things and make it a reality, often nicknamed as the architect. And that term I really grab, the idea that God has understood, and as an architect is somebody who sits down and has got a great picture as to in their head as to what they want the builders to build, and sits down and mathematically works it all out. And so many scientists have come to faith in Jesus because they were non-believers, but as they've begun to look at the sheer amount of individual detail that makes up the beauty of creation, they can't help but go, it is as though somebody has sat down and has designed this. The architect is behind this. Who is the architect leading them to Christ? I love that. And this is a story that many people use. So the architect, right, becomes human and becomes the perfect human, the perfect specimen. Do you know what a word for that is? The archetype. The archetype is someone who is the perfect specimen of whatever it is we're talking about. So take this, that Jesus, right, God, the architect, becomes the archetype. Jesus is God in human form. And he's perfect. He's the perfect specimen. He's without sin. And it's because he's without sin that as he dies on the cross for you and for me, that's what pays the ultimate penalty. Why? Because he is the spotless lamb. We looked at this a few weeks back. The architect becomes the archetype. The two particular stories that we're going to look at is this. At the end of our sermon last week, Jesus in Mark chapter 5, verse 41, sits down with a young girl who has died and takes her by the hand. And in this, there's this just beautiful moment where Jesus arrives and he is about to go up and to the upper room where their daughter is. And he's met by people who say to the synagogue leader, "Do not trouble the teacher, for she has already died." So before Jesus even gets there, they've died. And when Jesus and his disciples arrive, there are so many people there mourning. So she's been dead long enough that they've gathered a group of people who are there, who are mourning, wailing, dressed in black, who are literally grieving the death of this daughter. And Jesus states, "What is all this weeping and commotion? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep." And the crowd laugh at him, but he made for them all to leave. And he took the girl's father, the girl's mother, and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was laying. And what does he do? Holding her hand. Holding her hand. Guys, in this moment, Jesus reaches down and takes hold of that was dead. And in that moment, life is brought into being. Just allow that to hit you for a moment. This is Jesus. He reaches down. He takes this hand of this little girl. And she comes back to life. Now, for a moment, place yourself as a young child. What do most kids look forward to? Well, they look forward to playing with their friends. They look forward to being out and about. They look forward to growing up. Most children do. Can't wait to grow up. They've got wonderful ideas as to what they want to be. Most children, it's, I want to go on to do something amazing. Might be to become a nurse, to become a doctor, maybe to become an astronaut, maybe to become the next president of the world, or whatever it is. Yeah, this little girl, all of her dreams died with her in that moment. The physicalness of everything that she never imagined for one moment that this sickness that she got was going to end up claiming her life, yet it did. And as Jesus takes hold of this little girl, not only is she physically brought back to life, but so too is all of her dreams and hopes, and all of their hopes and dreams of her parents. And this moment is beautiful because suddenly this is a little girl with an entire life ahead of her is brought back to life as Jesus takes her hand. There is another amazing story. It's one of my favorite, and we're going to finish up by taking just a little bit of a brief look at this. As Jesus, the perfect one, the archetype, steps into another situation and transforms it. In Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 until the end of the chapter, it reads as follows. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross over to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills to pray by himself. Night fell while he was alone. So just take a moment. I or just explained, like Jesus was busy. Jesus, like gosh, like if anybody understands the concept of busyness, it's him. But does he allow the business to become his identity? No, what does he do? It says here that he sends them home, sends the people home, sends his disciples on and says, I'll meet you, and goes up and into the hills for some quiet time with God. Do you know what? Maybe of all the takeaways from this, perhaps we need to be just a little challenged by that moment. Jesus pulls himself away from the crowd, away from the busyness, to recenter himself and to come back to God and to spend time in prayer. Verse 24, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified and filled with fear. They cried out, "It is a ghost." But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here." Then Peter called out, "Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong winds and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," said Jesus. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped and the disciples worshipped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. After they crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret, where the people recognized Jesus, and the news of his arrival spread quickly throughout the whole area, and soon people were bringing all their sick to be healed. They begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. There's the example I gave earlier. So take a moment just to go through this. So the part I want to grab onto at this point is Peter walking on the water. We sing the song, "Oceans, you called me out upon the water." And that kind of like sense that they see Jesus and they're full of fear. Why? Because the whole scenario is fearful. They're on a lake, and I don't know about you, but when I think of the word lake, I naturally just think of, I don't know, maybe like Sutton Park, maybe. But I think that actually doesn't do it justice. I think basically the lakes that they're talking about here are lakes that are so big that actually it's difficult to see the land on the other side. So big that actually, should there be strong winds, that on that lake you are in danger, that the waves become big. So this is not Sutton Park style lake. This is probably like, maybe somewhere in the Lake District, one of the bigger lakes that are there, perhaps quite a bit bigger. So we've got this sense of like, as these people who are sailing across, Peter, James and John, the three of them are fishermen. These guys are like well-equipped sailors. So if they're struggling, this tells you that this is a decent size strength storm. And they are fearful before Jesus even arrives. And then they see Jesus and their gut reaction is, it is a ghost. And then Jesus says something which I want for us to take hold of. Because what is it he says? "Do not be afraid. Take courage. I am here." Take courage. I am here. I think that we need to be aware just of who Jesus is. Because I think if we're aware that if Jesus comes into our scenario, all fear dissipates. His peace comes into that moment. Now, that's not to say that the storm suddenly disappears, because we don't see that happen until much later on. But that actually in that moment, Jesus brings about a sense of peace. And I think many of us need to be able to grasp this, that actually, do you know what, just because we're a Christian does not mean that we are going to live a life that is absent of storms. The disciples clearly show that that is not the case. But what it does show is in this story that Jesus, in the midst of a storm, brings with him peace. That there is no need for anxiety, for depression. There's no need for fear in that moment. Why? Because we are to take courage because Jesus is there. And then we have this wonderfully surreal moment in this, where Peter makes this incredible statement. And I'm so glad that he did, because this is a story so worth it. Because he's the one who shouts out and says, Lord, if it really is you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Now, John's the one who's close to Jesus too. So too is James. These are the three that we saw going into the upper room where Jairus' daughter is healed. Why is it only Peter that's shouting this? Because I would think, being me, I would think of probably one of John's greatest regrets is that he's not the one that leapt out of the boat. Would you not think that? What about James? Where is he at this moment? But it's Peter. And he makes this statement. And I'm so glad that he did. Lord, if it is you. Well, what does Jesus say? He calls him out into the water. And as he does, he steps out of the boat and he begins walking. Do you know what? If the story ended there, wow. That's a moment. And I imagine the rest of the disciples are watching this to see if the man fails. If not, would they be then shouting, all right, my turn? Who knows what this scenario would be. But as he jumps out, he begins walking on the water towards Jesus. However, verse 30 says that actually then he begins to look around him and he sees the strong winds and the waves and he's terrified and he began to sink. He began to sink. This painting that you can see now on the screen is a painting that has always grabbed my attention. This is of Jesus stepping into that moment and putting his hand into the water. Now, it doesn't say that Peter had completely sunk by this moment. Was Peter waist deep? Was just his hand sticking out of the water? Was he completely engulfed? I don't know. But I love this picture because it shows Jesus smiling. And I think that the artist grabs this so beautifully as he looks and we've got Jesus smiling and you can see his feet crystal clear as the feet are on top of the water and the hand thrust through the waves, reaching down to grab hold of Peter by the hand and pull him out. This moment is something I want for us to grab. Guys, I don't know what scenario you're in at the moment or what scenarios you might find yourself in the future. But know this, in the presence of Jesus, the archetype, the perfect one, God incarnate, in the presence of Christ, peace comes. As we reach out to grab him, be that grab the hem of his garment or to grab him by the hand. Know this, that Jesus isn't standing back allowing it to happen, but Jesus reaches out and takes the hand. And as we saw with the little girl, it makes me wonder how many of us have seen hopes dashed, dreams destroyed, things that we genuinely thought God was going to do. And that in that moment of all of our hopes just being dashed upon the rocks, that we identify with that little girl. Well, you need to know that Jesus sitting on the edge of the bed, taking the girl's hand, maybe that's you today. Jesus wants to take you by the hand and restore you, restore your hopes, restore your dreams. Maybe those hopes, maybe those dreams might begin to twist slightly from perhaps what you'd want into what he'd want for you. Or maybe like Peter, in that moment that he steps out and starts to walk on the water, that there's that moment of utter fear when you begin to look around and see the waves. You see the difficulty of life. And I think so many Christians have made that leap, have kind of said, actually, you know what, Jesus, I'm going to follow you. And for a brief moment, it's felt amazing. And then the storm of life hits. And instead of keeping your eyes fixed on Jesus, you doubt. See the waves. Feel the wind, and is just overcome with fear and begin to find yourself sinking. And you need to know that, for one, it's okay, because Jesus is there. And as Peter cries out to Jesus, Jesus steps in and rescues. And I think so many of us need to be aware that when we call upon Jesus, he will step in. He will take you by the hand. Jesus is tangible. He's tactile. The archetype wishes to save you. The architect, the one who designed it all, the one who put it all together and seeing beauty in everything, steps from the confines of heaven and into our lives. As the architect becomes the archetype, he then reaches into our lives to save us, to bring about his healing to our lives. And I think maybe, do you know what? I think today, sitting here, you may be feeling that actually you need a touch from God. Maybe life's difficult. Maybe stuff's hard. And I would encourage you to take a moment and to pray and to invite Jesus to step into the situation. Maybe some of you are sitting in the boat and have seen your friends make these steps of faith, and you're thinking, I need Jesus in my life. I want that to be a reality for me, to be called out of the comfort and into the adventure. And know this, that no matter what happens in life, no matter how difficult things get, if we're walking with Jesus, death is not the end. It would have been for Peter, but he called out to Jesus. And in that moment, Jesus steps down, takes us by the hand. So today my challenge is this. Jesus is tangible, but it requires us to take that step and say, Lord, come meet me. Let's take a moment just to pray. Heavenly Father, I just pray, God, that you'd help us to see with spiritual eyes who you are. Grant us the boldness to call upon you. For those in the building that are sitting in the boat, Lord, who are considering jumping out, as they do, maybe today for the first time, may they sense your guiding hand as they join you in the adventure. Lord, for those who feel like their hopes and dreams have died, that life is not what they'd hoped for, and that life is difficult, as you sat on the bed, reached out and held the hand, saying, Talitha Cal, little girl, wake up. May those words be spoken to us as we're encouraged likewise to get up. Lord, restoring hopes and dreams in you. For those who feel overcome just by the worries of this world, who just feel that the storm is raging and that they feel alone and lost and sinking, Jesus, as they call upon you this morning, would you reach down with your hand, take them by the hand, and lift us up. and into your kingdom. Lord, be with us this week, we ask. In Jesus' name. Amen.